Hey everybody, it's Ed. Before we get started, I wanted to make sure that you all knew about my weekly email. It's called Good News from the American West. For over 3 years now, I've been sending it out every single Wednesday. I send out a few bullet points featuring only good news. No bad news, no inflammatory nonsense, no political stuff, nothing that's going to make anybody mad. It's only good things that are happening here in the American West. Through my work in conservation and work through this podcast, I've realized that there's a lot of really, really great, inspiring, funny, fun stuff that'll make you feel better than the average news story will. And so I've started highlighting that. I started it back in 2020, and I've continued to do it, and it's built up a pretty good following. No strings attached, no spam, nothing like that. But if you're looking for a weekly dose of good news from here in the West, I'd encourage you to sign up. You can go to my website to sign up, or you can follow the link in the episode notes. Thanks so much. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is John Vaillant. John is a renowned writer and journalist whose work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, National Geographic, and more. And he's also the author of classic books including The Tiger and The Golden Spruce. His most recent book is titled Fire Weather, A True Story from a Hotter World. And it's a must-read for anyone interested in wildfires, humans' relationship with fire, and the future of fire-related disasters. And you don't have to take my word for it. The book won the 2023 Bailey Gifford Prize for Nonfiction and was a finalist for both the National Book Award and the Hillary Weston Writers Trust Prize for Nonfiction. Fire Weather tells the story of the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire, a historic and apocalyptic fire that torched the city of Fort McMurray, Alberta, and spread across nearly 1.5 million acres of forest. With this epic disaster as the focal point, John masterfully weaves in the fascinating histories of fire, the fossil fuel industry, and climate science. He also explores 21st century wildfires, why they're hotter, more aggressive, and more destructive than anything we've seen before. Whether you're interested in the science of fire and forest health, the fascinating relationship between humans and fire, or you're just looking for a book that you won't be able to put down, I give Fire Weather my highest endorsement. Wildfires are obviously becoming more and more intense and destructive here in the West, so I was excited to chat with John and dig deeper into the histories of fire and the outlook for the future. We talk about why he decided to spend so many years writing about this particular wildfire and how the book's ingenious structure came to him in a dream. We talk about the similarities between living beings and fire, a fascinating idea known as the Lucretius Problem, some of the story's larger-than-life characters, John's long-term goals for the book, some of his favorite books, and much, much more. A huge thanks to John for writing such an impactful book and for taking the time to chat with me. I encourage you to pick up a copy of Fire Weather as soon as you can, but in the meantime, enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with John Vaillant. All right. Well, John, I'm very happy to have you here. We were talking just now before we started recording, and I was saying somehow I had not read your previous books, The Tiger, Golden Spruce, Jaguar Children, and I feel like a bonehead because your writing is so aligned with everything I love. And so thankfully you were nice enough to send me a advanced copy a while back of Fire Weather. And I read it so quickly and loved every bit of it. And I think I'm probably going to read it again because there's so much great info in there, particularly for the things that I'm interested in. And so as I was preparing for this interview, I found a really cool article, a profile about you from a long time ago. And you were talking about your motivating principles for writing. And you mentioned an author named Jonathan D. And you said that he had told you, don't write about what you know, write about what you want to know. And so my question for you is, when did you realize that you wanted to know about fire, about the petroleum industry, about this insane fire that happened in Fort McMurray, Alberta? When did all this kind of crystallize in your brain that you thought, all right, I'm ready to devote years to understanding this?
The Alberta tar sands had been in my consciousness, ever since I moved out to Western Canada, back in the late 90s. And I hadn't been able to figure out a way in. I knew it was such an enormous and egregious operation up there. It was so unlike any other petroleum recovery project anywhere on earth. Anything that Americans know about. This is totally different because it's basically tar-soaked sand that they're working with. But it was hard to find a way in there, and I saw other writers struggle and often fail to write about it. So I kind of put it out of my mind. And then the signal moment, for a lot of people on the fire file, on the climate file, on the Canadian energy file, was the Fort McMurray fire of May 2016. And so I was working on another project at the time. I was actually out of the country at the time, and made the mistake, you could say, of looking at Twitter on May 3rd, and these really shocking images were just rolling through. And this entire city of Fort McMurray, this boreal petroleum hub 600 miles north of the Montana border, was completely shrouded in smoke. So this is a city that has, between permanent and temporary workers, about 90,000 people. It's the largest source of foreign petroleum exports into the United States, originates in Fort McMurray. It's really an important place in the Canadian economy and psyche. And it looked like it was completely on fire. And nobody knew who was still in there or how many had gotten out. It was really shocking and completely unexpected. So that was a jarring, totally arresting moment. And I knew, I was in Europe at the time, and so I thought, well, I'm in the wrong place right now. And I knew journalists were going to be piling onto this story, and they did, and rightly so. And some really good and brave on-the-ground journalism was done during those days and weeks. And I kind of set it aside. I thought, well, books are going to be written about this. I'd never really competed for a current story before. My other books, as you may know, are really about events from the recent past, but they're from the past. So they kind of stay where you left them. You're like when you're kids before they can crawl, they're still there when you go out of the room and come back. Yeah. But with a current event story, it moves much more quickly, and there's a lot more competition for it if it's compelling. And this was, the biggest story to come out of Western Canada in a generation, I would say. It was massive. So it took a few days of kind of mulling it over and trying to get back into my old project, which was fiction. And I just couldn't get the fire out of my mind, in part because I was really afraid for the people there. There was this colossal fire cloud, a pyrocumulonimbus cloud developed over the city. This is a self-perpetuating 45,000 foot tall firestorm system that rotates like a hurricane. That's what was over the city. And nobody knew who had died and who hadn't. And it just was, you just sort of think about all the people there, and, you could see them streaming out like ants. There's one road in, one road out, Highway 63. It was bumper to bumper traffic. So there's fire all along the road, and people are going 3 miles an hour, bumper to bumper. It's like rush hour, but the entire city is evacuating. And, how are they going to do it? There's only one road. So there was a lot of uncertainty for a number of days. And then they ascertained, they thought they got everybody out. And that was kind of miraculous. And, it happened really pretty quickly as I came to understand the ferocity of the fire and realizing the intensity of the energy unleashed on this place was truly apocalyptic in terms of the temperatures attained, metal melting temperatures. And this was all just out of the forest. This wasn't a refinery. No refineries or upgraders caught on fire. This was a purely, quote unquote, natural fire. And yet it turned Fort McMurray into another planet, basically into a fire planet, where everything that happened there was in the aid of combustion. That's how hot it was. The temperature combined with the fire was able to convert anything remotely flammable into an explosive opportunity. And that really got me thinking about a lot of things, which we can get into further. But the last piece of this, that where it really coalesced for me that there was a book here, was this place I was staying had a kind of a day bed in it. It was a writing studio and in Europe. And I took a nap, and I woke up from the nap with this dream in my head. And it was 4 mountain climbers ascending the same mountain, but from 4 different faces. So they were unaware of each other. And they're all climbing, and they don't realize that there are other people on the mountain until they all coalesce at the summit simultaneously. And I sat up out of the dream, and I realized, oh, wow, that's the history of climate science, the petroleum industry, the automobile industry, and fire behavior. They're all coalescing, and they all coalesced in Fort McMurray in 2016 in the month of May. And that's when I realized, okay, we've arrived at a historical moment, like, in geologic time, in climate time, in technological time, in energetic time. We've achieved this kind of terrible confluence. And that's what made me realize there's a book here. There's something to build all this around. A structure.
That's really, really interesting. And one question about the dream, had anything like that ever happened to you before in your writing career? Had you ever had dreams ever been a part of your, for lack of a better term, your writing process?
Well, it's a funny thing, Ed, because I'm a nonfiction guy.
Yeah.
And so I'm really reality-based, science-based. All my nonfiction work is totally cited. The idea that I approach it with is the reader should be able to go and basically recreate the experience from my notes and citations. They should be able to go back and see everybody and see the sources and see the process. But I get other information sometimes. And that's where my only novel, The Jaguar's Children, came completely out of a visitation. And I was in Mexico at the time, but I was still working on The Tiger, a nonfiction book set in the Russian Far East. Couldn't be more different than Mexico. And I'm there editing that, getting that ready for publication, when this voice just came into my head. And it was this young Mexican guy explaining to me that he was really in trouble and he was stuck inside a water tanker truck somewhere on the US-Mexican border. And he was calling for help through his phone. And I don't know where that came from. And I was working on The Tiger. And so the guy's name was Hector. And I basically said Hector, I can't deal with this right now. And so I just wrote down everything he said and put it away. And then 2 years later, I went to a writer's retreat and wrote the draft of the novel in 6 weeks.
Did you really?
Based on that. Yeah, no, that was, I can't explain where that comes from, Ed. And I've had another dream like that too, that started another novel where this, completely distinct voice shows up. This other one was this young guy, and it was, in Vermont in 1861. He was on a farm, and he was describing his brother getting attacked by bees and going into anaphylactic shock, which of course they didn't call it then, but that was the scenario. And I woke up and wrote it all down, and it was a really, really strong voice. So that's, completely different from nonfiction. And I have no control over those. I don't know where they come from. I think a lot of people who write fiction, though, do have visionary, otherworldly, parallel universe type experiences that they're able to channel, into the work, so they don't seem like they're totally insane. And, but it's, it's a beautiful gift in a way. It's super strange, and it happens very seldom to me, and it's certainly a shock every time.
That's so interesting to hear that. And I love it that's one part of your process and part of how your brain works. And then, for example, in fire weather, I bet you got close to 100 pages of end notes here. This thing is just unbelievably researched. And that's one question I want to ask later on about your process. Well, I'll go ahead and ask it now. When you are dealing with this much information and this many sources and this many very, very, very complex ideas, both scientific and then, you even go into different ideas around philosophy. How do you even begin to organize all of that? Like physically organize the information in a way that you can put it to use when it comes time to actually start writing?
Boy, Ed, it was really hard. This is the most difficult book I've ever written, certainly the most complex. Those 4 topics I mentioned to you, climbing the mountain, any one of those could be a really solid book on its own.
Oh, yeah.
And trying to braid those together, no one has done that. And there's a really good reason no one's done it. It's incredibly difficult. And it's the information is unwieldy in part because it moves at a different pace. The history of climate science goes back 250 years. The history of the petroleum industry is, 150 years. Climate change is much faster. And then fire exists kind of out of time. And yet it responds to local conditions. So you're dealing in these, it's like trying to write a symphony in 4 different time signatures. And it was overwhelming to me. It frankly was beyond my ability. And I spent it took me 7 years to do it. And I spent a lot of that time blundering around, just writing sections of it and trying to find the rhythm and the pace for that particular section. And then stitching it together, I have the distinct awareness that Fire Weather is a Frankenstein, and you can really still see the sutures in it. It's not a perfect book by any means. I don't know really how elegant it is. I understand that I did something difficult, and it took 2 editors, leaning on it and trying to help me structure it. And I got the 3-part structure, fairly quickly. That's fairly easy to do. And I use that for the Tiger too. And that's kind of handy. But, they're, like the same way you can see the bolts in Frankenstein's neck and the big sutures going across his appendages. That's how I feel about this. It's just, there's some things that don't naturally go together that I simply integrated. And I'm proud of it. I'm glad. It's what I wanted to do. And I understood that in this moment, you can't write about one without writing about the other. They all inform and energize each other. But there was no template for how to put that together. And so it was extraordinarily difficult for me because I don't think I have a really organized mind. And I think that, that's where the fiction comes in. There's an intuitive component here. So I'm really feeling my way through and I'm kind of knowing it when I see it, as opposed to being a chess player, plotting it out 12 moves ahead. Like I could never write a murder mystery. I don't think. I just don't have that kind of, A to B to C, all those logical moves that end up in this interesting place. This is much more of an exploration. And then the editors really helped wrangle it basically, into something that made some kind of sense. But, there's a lot to criticize in the book structurally that I take total responsibility for. But at the same time, I can also say to anybody, show me a better way, show me another way to do it. And I'll be super interested to see how they crack that nut.
Well, no, I mean, that's what I was thinking about as I was reading it is the way you said writing symphony with different time scales. I mean, I think that's a great analogy because there's so many different things going on in the book, but it all blends together in a narrative that is obviously very informative, but it's fun to read. And one of the things I noticed, I don't even know if this is something that real writers think about, but as you're going through the details of the actual fire, there's a pace to the way you write that's very exciting. And it's a page turner kind of reading, but you somehow manage to keep up this exciting pace and it doesn't get exhausting or it's not too much. It kept me going. And I wanted more, but I've read books before where it's just like, all right, this needs to calm down. This is too much to take in. And then, one of the things that initially in the book that really, really captured my attention was history of fire, thoughts about fire, and how close fire is to being alive and almost being human in certain ways. And I'd never thought about that before, but as you go through it, and then at the end of the book, you talk about how fire is very similar in a way to corporate structures of like publicly traded companies and their intent when they're in their growth at all costs. And so I was wondering if you could just give kind of an overview of these similarities between living beings or even humans and fire.
Yeah, for sure. And I just wanted to speak briefly to your comment about pacing.
Okay, yeah.
And that is so critical, because I know what you mean, and I worried about in the fire section. It's so relentless. There's so much burning and chaos, and is it just going to hit one note? It's sort of like, that's kind of my experience of heavy metal. It's
Sure.
just all up to 11 all the time, and that modulation, is really key. But if you modulate kind of too low, the energy can really sag. And so that's something I really, really focus on. Every paragraph has to have some kind of payoff. And it either has to have some kind of amazing detail and a remarkable quote, a startling fact, a really beautiful, compelling passage, something that, it's like a flavor burst, like a little zing. And so no matter what I'm writing about, whether it's something historical or something, very action oriented, I think about that with each paragraph. And then you also do need to have these kind of quieter moments where people can kind of catch their breath. And you can even do that with a double space on the page, just create a little bit of air in there on the page. And so people can just oxygenate again and have a moment of reflection, or just understand that, okay, that's over. I'm going to get a little relief here. And that's something that I do feel more confident in than at the structural level. Like I feel very at home and at the paragraph level. So that's a response to that, which is, I raise it just because it's so important to me as a writer. That's
good.
Really,
I'm glad. I thought maybe I was just like making something up that writers don't actually think about.
You are picking up on something that I think every writer is attentive to, or should be attentive to.
Should be, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, each paragraph they're these units of time and action and forward movement. And there's certain ingredients that I feel that every one of them should have. You can't have dead spaces. Then the question of fire is, incredibly interesting. And that was, in some ways, one of the greatest gifts of going slowly through this book, is it really allowed me and forced me to sit in the fire, as it were, and get beyond where, most people leave off. And, we talk about fire, as this, ferocious energy, and it's charismatic and very destructive. And I was, first, as I came to understand that fire behavior is changing on Earth. And that was a really intense thing to register. Starting around 2000, fires began doing different things on landscapes where they had previously behaved in relatively predictable ways. And so, we had our first fire tornado in Canberra, Australia in 2003. We had the most intense fire ever measured on Earth in the Alberta boreal forest in 2001. Fairly significant town burned severely in Alberta in 2011. Fort McMurray caught fire in 2016. And then we've just had this parade of devastating fires since then. The Tubbs fire in California, 9,000 structures in 2017. Paradise campfire in 2018. The Riveting fire tornado in California. That's the first time we've had a fire tornado in the Northern Hemisphere. And then, Australia burned catastrophically in 2019, 2020. Canada burned catastrophically just this summer. So on and on it goes. And it was, I think, incumbent then on anybody writing about fire now to really get at its essence. And as I looked at our relationship to combustion especially through fossil fuels, because I think something that's easy to forget, we talk about energy, and human beings are really attracted to energy. It's sexy and compelling and helps you make money, and it does all the things that humans aspire to. But the energy that we use is derived almost entirely from fire. And, a lot of electricity generation goes back to coal-fired generators. And then obviously, automobiles and petroleum and heating and so much of it is fire-based. So we're a fire-driven civilization, but we're really a fire-driven species. If you go back to South Africa 1 million years ago, there are evidence of hearths, of fireplaces, and only hominids could make them. This is before Homo sapiens. Fire has been with us, has been a companion of ours, literally forever. It's in our DNA. It helped us become who we are. And so then I started thinking about it as a companion. And wait a second, fire, which is a chemical reaction, it's kind of a chemical equivalent to a dog. The dog is bred, domesticated from wild and dangerous wolves, something you would never want to have in your house, something you would never want to leave your child with. And I realize there are exceptional stories of humans and wolves, and I accept that. But in general, it would be ill-advised to leave your kids with one, especially if they were hungry. And so, and likewise with fire, you'd never leave your kids alone with fire. And yet now we have dogs sleeping in our children's rooms, and we have fires burning in our basement all night long in our hot water heaters and furnaces, and we feel comforted by it rather than alarmed or afraid of it. So we've done this amazing process of domestication. And then I started thinking, okay, I see how we relate to dogs. We're mammals. We're very visual. We look at each other. We understand each other to a very sophisticated degree. We relate. We're both warm bodies that can snuggle up to each other. And then I started thinking about fire like that. And wait a sec, fire's kind of the same way. You know, when the coziest living room is the one that has a fire in the fireplace or the stove and a dog curled up in front of it, and you and your fellow humans gathered around it. And that feels right. Feels really good to a lot of us, especially in the Northern Hemisphere in cooler climates. So then I thought, okay, could we possibly be related in some way? And this is where, you know, it gets really weird and far out, Ed. Fire is fire. It's this flickering, dancy orange thing that will burn the crap out of you if you put your hand in it. And, you know, but a dog will, you know, really mangle your hand if you stuff your hand into its face. And so I started thinking about that, and I posed the question to myself almost kind of as an intellectual exercise. Okay, I can see the kind of common ancestry of humans and dogs. You know, we're mammals and raise our young in fairly similar ways, and we're social and all this. Could we have a common ancestor with fire? And I went back and back and back and eventually arrived at oxygen. And it's not an ancestor in the sense of us being descended from it, but oxygen is why we're here. And it's why fire burns here. And it wasn't always like that on planet Earth. Fire is a relative newcomer. And so are we. And we certainly grew up with fire as a companion. So when I started thinking about that, about our dependence on oxygen, and then I just started thinking about breathing and oxidation, and then there are actually a lot of similarities between humans and fire. You know, for one thing, you know, we both can be suffocated.
Yeah.
You know, you put a jar over a candle and it's going to go out, and you put us, you know, into a plastic bag or, you know, some sealed room without oxygen, and we'll go out too. And so then I started thinking about other similarities. You know, we generate heat, we generate emissions. Both of us generate CO2 as we burn, as we breathe. And then I started thinking about what we feed on and just the whole notion of oxidation. You know, it's a mixture of chemistry, but also metaphysics. And especially when you think about the way it makes us behave. And because if you burn oxygen, it doesn't matter if you're a fire or an octopus or an oil executive or you and me or our kids, we all move around. We all have to stay in motion to find more fuel, to fuel the engine to facilitate oxidation. So if we stop breathing and we'll suffocate. If we stop consuming fuel, we're going to starve. And so the only way for oxidizing creatures on planet Earth to meet their needs for fuel is to keep moving. and just watch a fire, moving a prairie fire, the way it moves across the grass or moves through the treetops in the forest, and look at us. If you step back and watch our behavior, we're going to the fridge, we're going to the sink, we're going to work to make more money so that we can put stuff in the fridge and pay for the sink. And that struck me as really interesting. And then, from there, I kind of extrapolated out into corporate behavior. And that's another, can of worms we can open if you want to.
Yeah, it was one of those things that when I read it, it made perfect sense. And I was just thinking, why had I never thought of that before? And it was just a very fascinating way of thinking about things. And then there was another part. I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but I could ask you questions for 5 hours. So I'm just going to there was another concept that you introduced me to that I think is, you can apply it to our individual lives or to us as a society as we think about climate change and think about these disasters. And I believe you pronounced it the Lucretius Problem. Is that pronounced correctly? I was wondering if you could go through that, because just your explanation of that made me really understand or get a better idea of how we're kind of getting into these crazy situations, whether it's climate or whether, COVID type things, or whether as crazy as these, it's an awful thing to even mention, but like school shootings, things that we just could never have believed. And so could you just talk a bit about that concept?
Yeah. I think, we evolved, and we evolved from small communal units, in the African savanna. And we've come a long way in a relatively short time. And we're now capable of releasing energies and doing things and having impacts that we really didn't necessarily evolve for. So we're kind of operating kind of above our pay grade in a lot of ways. And this has been identified for a long time. And one of these kind of glitches, I would say, in our system, in the way that we perceive and behave in the world, is this idea of the Lucretius Problem. And Lucretius was a poet and philosopher who lived in Rome back in the first century BC. And what he observed was this kind of limitation in human perception that led people to kind of assume that the biggest thing that was the biggest thing that they had seen personally. And so, for example, right now I'm looking out at the coastal mountains of British Columbia. They're, between 3,000 and 5,000 feet tall. They are really big mountains. If those are the only mountains you ever saw, they're massive. They really take up a lot of space. But then you go to the Rockies and it's a whole nother order. And then you go to the Andes, and then you go to the Himalayas. And so there's a lot out there that we haven't seen that is bigger and more intense, more extreme, more anything than we have perceived or allowed the possibility of. And so where this collides with human behavior and human responses, especially to climate change, is there's still a lot of places in the world where people are fighting fires like it's 1995. And we're out of the 20th century now. And it's a really hard thing to imagine that fires could be different, could be bigger, could move faster, could burn hotter in our lifetimes. But that's what's happening. And so, those little coastal mountains that I'm used to, are now, imagine waking up one morning and the mountains were Himalaya mountains out your window. And that would be really shocking and disorienting. And none of your equipment works for that. My climbing and skiing equipment, is designed for 5,000 foot mountains, not 25,000 foot mountains. And so likewise, a lot of firefighters are finding themselves in that situation with fire behavior. And it's so people are preparing for the future by looking backwards. And this introduces a term that I use in the book, coined, I think, by Alex Steffen, a futurist. It's called discontinuity. And a discontinuity is when past experience and expertise cease to be useful in dealing with current and future challenges and problems. And all the equipment that folks had in Fort McMurray to fight fire was designed for 1990s, 1980s fires. And the fire that swept through their city in May 2016 was a 21st century fire. And there's just no place for a fire truck. It has no relevance in the face of a fire like that. And that is really shocking for human beings to be confronted with that.
There's just these concepts in the book like that, these high level concepts that kind of frameworks for thinking about things that far beyond fire that I found very interesting. But then you, in certain parts of the book, you zoom in to almost, to the micro level. So you're, at some point you're talking about these big philosophical concepts. And then one that comes to mind is the scene where you're talking about Wayne McGraw, I believe is how you pronounce his last name. Mm-hmm. And this character that gets involved in this insane, crazy fight to save his house. And I don't want to spoil any of the book, but I'm curious if you could talk a bit about Wayne and his fight against and then just how do you go about finding these characters? Like, how did he, I think it's obvious why he stuck out because he seems like such a character, but I think that's one of the very important parts of this book is these real individuals that I think anybody would find interesting and maybe could identify with, and that draws you in on a different level.
Yeah, I think one reason, I feel like we're in kind of a golden age of nonfiction right now and have been really for a generation or so. And I think one reason is because nonfiction writers have learned a lot from fiction writers. And fiction writers understand that character is central to the success of any novel. You really need compelling people who are rich and nuanced and relatable. And so nonfiction writers, paid attention to that. And so we've taken better care now to make sure we find really interesting people to connect with and follow, through the narrative. And Wayne McGraw is, just an extraordinary character born in a hard rock mining town in Labrador, Canada, which is a frigid granite-based place, just super gritty. And I think especially in the States, we think of Canadians as kind of soft and easygoing, but it's actually an extraordinarily difficult work environment up here and living environment. It gets really cold a lot of the time, and it's an unforgiving, not particularly generous environment in many ways. It's hard to grow food. It's hard to make a living. And so some of the characters that are forged in that atmosphere are really extreme. And Wayne McGraw was one such character. And he found his way up to Fort McMurray in Alberta, which is a long way from Labrador. And he was a machinist and a welder. And he had a real affinity for fast machines. So he had a whole fleet of really fast, kind of high performance snowmobiles, and he had a jet boat and motorcycle and trucks, and he had a whole shop, outside of his house in this beautiful suburban neighborhood he lived in Fort McMurray that happened to be on the southernmost face of the city where the fire entered. So he took the fire full in the teeth when it came through. And everybody else in that neighborhood, thousands of people, his neighbors, all evacuated. Everyone looked at it, and just said, I'm out of here. There's these flames were 300 feet tall, and the fire front was miles wide, like you could not see the edges of it. And this thing was like a tsunami of fire rolling over the landscape. And he said, nope, I got too much invested. You're not taking my snowmobiles. And so he set about fighting the fire by himself. And I found him. I think this is another weird, unpredictable aspect of nonfiction writing. And when the books really work, it's generally because the writer has found some magic keys. And the magic keys take the form of people who, for whatever reason, are connectors and take a shine to you and want to share the innermost parts of the world you're writing about. And they want to show you around. So most of us who are going into places where we frankly don't really belong and have no connections, like me in Fort McMurray, you find people who want to share it with you and want you to understand it. And they decide to trust you. And that's an enormous privilege. And in my case, I met an insurance agent, and in a Starbucks. In fact, he heard me talking to the barista, asking her about her experience of the fire, and he said, "Well, I actually know quite a bit about that." And I turned around, and here's this guy, and I didn't know who he was, but we started chatting, and he's a claims adjuster. So when you think about a city that burned, a claims adjuster is actually quite an important person. And so we started talking, and we became friends. And I went up there, repeatedly to Fort McMurray, and I'd always check in with them. I met some of his colleagues, and it turned out one of his colleagues, this woman, Sue McCormick, her client was this guy, Wayne McGraw. And it was only after, she'd sort of taken my measure over a couple of visits. She said, "Well, I have this client who actually stayed and tried to fight the fire by himself." And I said, "Oh, wow, could I meet him?" And we met. And again, because Sue McCormick had a very good relationship with this client, Wayne, he was predisposed to trust me because I came in with Sue's recommendation. And so what you're doing is you're building a kind of pathway of relationships into the community. And it's a gradual and very organic process that you really can't predict. And you just kind of got to be open and go where it leads. I just never would have occurred to me to conceive of someone like Wayne. But when Sue said, "Oh, I've got a client you might want to talk to," I didn't say, "Oh, thanks. No, I've got plenty of people already." I said, "Oh, well, sure. Let's go have a drink and see what happens." And he told me that one of the most extraordinary stories I've ever heard. And, it's kind of neat to do, again, as a writer. I feel like a lot of my job, I'm exploring some wild ideas, and that's really interesting to do. But to me, some of the most satisfying and gratifying parts of writing a book are creating platforms so that people who you normally would never meet get to talk about their lives. And no one, has ever interviewed Wayne, before this fire. And that chapter where he describes how he tried to save his house, it's almost verbatim. I don't intervene very much. I set the scene, and then I just step back and let this very accomplished storyteller describe a situation that most people would never live through, and most people would never attempt it anyway. I mean, what he did was so audacious and kind of insanely ballsy and truly ill-advised. And yet he made it out, and he made it out for a really surprising reason, anyway, I won't go into too many details, but, it ended up being this incredible highlight and peak moment in the book and in my reporting, just in my life as a person meeting other people and hearing remarkable stories. I'll never forget Wayne.
After reading that, I love learning about kind of crazy people, crazy in a good way. And I was like, man, I need to get Wayne on the podcast.
Yeah.
But then, on the flip side of that, you're going, well, it's not really flip side, but as a offshoot of that, you're going in, you're building trust with these people. They're sharing, their thoughts, everything that they went through during this really, really intense period. And the bottom line is some people made mistakes. And so you strike me as a very, very kind, nice guy, but also one that is very, very focused on the facts and on telling a very accurate story. What's the mental process if you have to write about somebody in a not so flattering light? Because they're, in this book, and I researched some of the people on, looking them up on YouTube and seeing some of the press conferences that you had referenced. And some of these folks, they're good people and they were trying their best, but because of things like the Lucretius Problem, they just were not able to act in a way that if they could do it again, they would. So how do you go about when it comes time to write about somebody in a not so flattering light? How does that affect you mentally, I guess?
That's a key question. And it's one that was on my shoulder pretty much every day I was writing about that part of the fire. Mistakes were made. People in positions of authority, in positions of responsibility, who had thousands of lives depending on them, made some bad calls. And I thought then about, okay, what's my role here as a storyteller? And what scale am I writing this on? Am I doing an expose on Alberta firefighting practices and the compromising influences of the petroleum industry? Or am I trying to write a bigger story about fire climate change, our obsession with fire-powered energy in the form of in the form of petroleum, and really just looking at this is what humans do when they're confronted with energies they don't understand and have never experienced before. And so I decided to take that larger, longer view, more universal view, and not get into the weeds of assigning blame. And I feel like the other thing that, this is really a cardinal sin that I think writers do commit, and that is underestimating the intelligence of their readers.
Sure.
And I'm going to assume my reader is pretty smart, and that they're going to understand stuff I'm going to understand. And if they've come this far in the book, they're with me. So that means, and we've all had a lot of experience with all kinds of people. That's what humans do, is we experience other people and we make judgments and learn from those experiences, positive and negative. So I thought, I'm just going to let these people talk. I went to the press conferences, the recordings of the press conferences. I looked at their body language. I looked at how they said, what they said, and what was going on with the fire when they were saying the things they were saying. And I triangulated all that, and I leave it to the reader. And, in my view, kind of off the record, I don't mind if you, keep this in their interview, but there are people there who got promoted who should have been fired, and they got promoted instead. And that just shows, the weird, self-serving, self-preserving nature of institutional entities like governments and corporations. It's like failing upward. And so there were elements of that. And at the same time, I really have compassion for them because they were being confronted by something that they simply couldn't imagine. And here's the thing, as hindsight is perfect. But the fact is, though, and what pains me is that the evidence was there. The way Slave Lake, a neighboring town, had burned in 2011 showed what fire could do. And so there was this kind of hubristic element in Fort McMurray. We're a bigger city. Nothing can stop us. And when you look at the incredible infrastructure and machinery that they bring to bear every day, altering hundreds and thousands of miles of landscape to excavate bituminous sand and fractionate and boil it into something that resembles a petroleum product. I mean, it's one of the largest industrial projects anywhere on Earth, and tens of thousands of people work there. So you can see why they might think no natural force could impact us. But this natural force sure did. It shut the whole thing down. And that had never, ever happened before. So I think the advantage, the unassailable advantage that climate change has over us right now is we simply can't imagine the things it can do. When 50 inches of rain fell on Houston, Texas, I think it was Hurricane Rosa. I can't quite remember.
I remember that.
It's just an inconceivable number of inches of rain. Like, where does that come from? And so I think up to a point we can be forgiven for not being able to imagine it, but we've got a lot of data now. And Fort McMurray had the data. And the meteorologists gave perfect predictions. It wasn't like a freak wind suddenly blew into town. That was tracked and predicted ahead of time. The temperature and desperately low relative humidity, which really encourages fire behavior, that was all known and predicted. And there had been drought conditions all winter long, really low snowpack. Everything was really crunchy and crispy. Fuel-wise, this was all known. So all the signs were there, all the indicators were there for a catastrophic fire situation. And they did act, they did prepare, but again, they prepared for a 1990s fire, not a 21st century fire. And so it's a tricky one. And this is a dilemma that we all are going to find ourselves in. All of us have underestimated the forces that are confronting us. All of us have made bad decisions, whether to go out driving in a snowy weather or not get new tires and, skid or, whatever it is. We've all made some bad calls. And I feel like we need to hold our civic leaders to a higher standard because they stepped up for that job. But this was an extraordinary situation. And I think one of its utilities for readers who aren't from Alberta and aren't from Canada and may not be that interested in, that world is it's so human. What would you have done in that situation? What would you have done if you'd been given that information? And so that's the angle I tried to approach it from is again, more universal. People in Portugal, people in Boulder, Colorado, people on the island of Rhodes in Greece have had to deal with these exact same scenarios. There's a big plume on the horizon. Do we evacuate or not? What's the response? And that, raises this whole question of, and this is almost another human glitch, which is that our devotion to the status quo, how tightly we hold to the life we knew, to the life that we're comfortable with, that may actually be outmoded now.
As I was reading the book, I'm in Colorado Springs and I used to live in Boulder, and I continued thinking about the Marshall Fire in Boulder.
Yeah.
And my family and I were actually up there. It was right around New Year's, and we were spending the night in Boulder and having a little family vacation. We woke up that morning, unbelievably windy. I remember a branch fell out of the tree and hit one of my daughters, and we were like, let's get out of here. Cause we had just recently had a windstorm in Colorado Springs that put a tree on our house. So we got out of there probably 9 a.m., 9:30, getting blown all over the highway, and we get home. And then I see the road that we were on, and we had stopped at Chick-fil-A next to the Costco or whatever. And I saw a video from later that day where that Costco was literally flames were coming in the door. Jeez. And, how do you even imagine that? I mean, right. It's so easy to Monday morning quarterback it, but there's no way. There's a part in the book where you said that you're talking about 9/11, and if you're going to blame somebody, if you're going to blame a concept, you got to blame the lack of imagination, because who would have ever imagined it could happen? It's crazy. Yeah. One more question for you about this book. I saw recently you testified to Parliament about, using the book and the lessons you've learned from the book. And so that makes me think, obviously you set out to tell a really good story and you devoted many, many years to telling this story. Do you have other goals for this book? I mean, do you see it as a tool to make change, or how do you think about, now that the book is out there, it's done, obviously you've testified and you're sharing your expertise. Do you have any goals for the book beyond just telling these important stories?
Well, this book is different, Ed, in that way. And, other books I've written, I think of myself as a writer, and I'm trying to engage with the craft in a compelling way that, I can feel proud of and that readers can really relate to and be moved by. And, when I wrote The Tiger, I was hoping that it would raise the profile of tiger conservation and the urgent need to look after the landscapes that tigers depend on. And, and that it had that effect to a mild degree. This was a little different. Fireweather was a little different because it so directly impacts people's lives right now. And, just look at Lahaina. That is a devastating tragedy that will mark that island forever, and will mark, the electricity company, forever. Where those power lines that fell down and in the windstorm and ignited at least some of the fires that swept through that city. And likewise, with Paradise, so there are real stakes here that are immediate, ongoing, and truly terrifying. And so as I was writing the book and as I got to know people, they were so clearly wounded by what had happened to them, and they lived through it. And a lot of the people I interviewed didn't even lose property, but the fire was so traumatic. It was so intense and so destabilizing to their notion of what their life had been, that they're different now. And some of them have health issues. Some of them have PTSD. Some of them have moved away from the city, which they thought they would live, for the rest of their working lives anyway. And so I saw up close the damage that these events can do, even when they don't burn you alive. And so it's really cataclysmic energy. And Canada really, we never got a break all summer long. We had the worst fire season by practically orders of magnitude than we've ever had in the nation's history. So it's real and present. And so in that sense, Ed, the book is, it's a work of nonfiction and it's all this, but it's also a public service announcement.
Yes.
And there's a lot of information in there that if you read it, you will understand where we are now, climatically, energetically, politically, and in relation to fire. And so what has been really gratifying is some readers have been reading this book, moved by it, and gone to their local town and city councils and said, look, this could happen to us, and we need to think about fire in a more proactive way than we have been. And that, I think, is going to pay dividends. And we won't know. And I really hope we never have to find out. But that is definitely a goal. And I've definitely been getting more requests for interviews about this book, I think, because people can feel the urgency of it. And when they read the book and then they connect the dots to the news stories that they remember, to the things that they've seen around them, and they realize, oh gosh, this is really happening. This is really happening now, and it could potentially happen to me. And there are some things I can do, that are outlined in the book to make it less likely that I become a victim. That I can. There are proactive responses to this, and one of them is to decarbonize our energy system as rapidly as possible. But there's lots of things we can do on a smaller scale, right down to where you stack your firewood. If you have firewood. So that is something I've got a lot of energy for, and I'm up for talking to people about it as long as it feels urgent to them. It feels urgent to me.
Well, it really is just a holistic education on all aspects of it. And it's just amazing to me that you were able to fit it into and the copy I have is about 350 pages. And I mean, because this thing could have easily been, 3,000 pages. And it's just delivered in a way. I'm always amazed when writers like you and many others that I've had on this podcast are able to deliver all this important information. And I read it and I'm just having a great time reading. And then when I close the book, I'm like, wait, now I'm so much smarter and I know all this stuff that I didn't know before. And so I agree that it's a public service, and I'm just very thankful that you put in so many years and so much effort and stretched yourself, to put this out in the world. Cause I think it's just a great book, but it's very, very important. Two more questions for you. One of the things that's very clear in this book is that you love to read, and you quote many, many different authors, everybody from Milton and Paradise Lost to more modern day authors. And so I always like to find out what people like you are reading or have read. And it's a hard question for somebody like you, because I imagine your shelves are lined, or your walls are lined with books. But when you think about important books to you, maybe that have helped shape your worldview personally, professionally, do you have a few that are kind of standard recommendations you give people?
I do. Yeah. A book that really kind of set me on the path in a way was The Johnstown Flood by David McCullough. And that really became a model for me. I read that book and I thought, wow, I read it. I think I was in my late teens or maybe early 20s. I wasn't a writer yet. I didn't become a professional writer till my mid 30s. I did, not unlike yourself. I had other lives before I took the one I'm currently moving through. But the Johnstown Flood by David McCullough was really a moment for me. When I was about 15, I read Endurance by Alfred Lansing. Again, just amazing storytelling. And what really struck me about that's about the failed Shackleton expedition, and then the ultimate rescue of every single person, every member of that expedition from Antarctica, of all places, in, I think it was 1915. And what really impressed me about that was how Alfred Lansing relied on the journals and written records of the crew on that expedition. And so you really got to be in their voices. And that's where I think I realized the importance of, your job as the writer is to set the scene, but then you let the subjects do the talking and really give them the space and the airtime to tell it their way. And your job is just to be like a foil for them. And I found that very, very effective. And then, Moby Dick, as maybe trite or stereotypical as it may sound, was a seminal text for me. I read that when I was 14, and not that I really understood what was happening, but I understood that this was sort of a force I needed to reckon with. And I've been reckoning with that book ever since. And, the incredible detail he goes into about how you actually lay out a whaleboat. I just love that. A lot of people hate that kind of detail, but I love that kind of detail. And as a parent, what I could recommend to you, honestly, it was children's books that really laid the foundation. And I would read Holling Clancy Holling. He's still in print. He wrote a really famous book called Paddle to the Sea. There's another one called The Tree and the Trail, which in a way was the template for the Golden Spruce. And these are, technically children's books, but there's a lot of adult information in there. And it's presented in a way that you can relate to it if you're 6, you can relate to it if you're 12, you can relate to it if you're 32. And there's something for everybody in those books. And they're also beautifully illustrated. And then likewise, Virginia Lee Burton, these are great American writers who are, from the mid 20th century. Virginia Lee Burton, she wrote Mike Mulligan's Steam Shovel, and I think I kind of learned to be fascinated by heavy machinery through that book. And then she wrote another really beautiful book called Life's Story, which presents the history of life on Earth and the creation of Earth and then a subsequent life on Earth as a stage play. And as you turn the pages, it's the next scene, it's the next era. And I read that as a kid, and you kind of got to see the grandeur of creation and ways of describing it to other people through narrative and through illustration. And so those books too, I really can't discount those. Those are just as important as adult nonfiction and fiction.
I love all those, especially the kids ones, and because both girls are reading a ton, but my 8-year-old, it's wild how much she reads and writes, and so I'll pick those up probably today for her.
Yeah, they're dated, but I think they're, especially maybe if you read it with them, they're so elegant. I mean, these people are masters at what they do. They're so classy and erudite and beautiful. It's really the best of everything in my view.
Awesome. Thank you. Last question for you. The people that listen to this podcast, I get a lot of, emails and electronic communication that I've had the pleasure of meeting a lot of them over the years. And I'm always just, first of all, so surprised that anybody listens. And then I'm also very happy to meet these people because they're all just so curious. A lot of them are doing purpose-driven work, whether it's for their job or on volunteer basis. This type of book like Fire Weather is exactly the kind of thing that they'll want to read. And so knowing that that's kind of the audience, do you have any words of wisdom, closing words, anything you'd like to kind of wrap it up with?
Well, yeah, one would be get to know your local firefighters. They're really amazing, committed, courageous people who really want to do the right thing and really want to help and are confronting climate change, not in an activist way necessarily, but they're confronting the changes. They're really seeing and going with the conferences they go to. They're really they're understanding that fire burns, with a different kind of intensity now, and obviously their lives depend on understanding that. And depending on where you live, especially if you live in the WUI, in the wildland urban interface, near state land, near forested areas, near fire prone areas, they're a really important part of the community, and there's a lot of good advice they have. We call it Fire Smart up in Canada. I'm not sure what it's called in the States, but it's a program that offers ways of looking at your property, looking at your neighborhood, and changing some pretty simple things that will make your place less fire prone, less susceptible. So that would be one. And then another would be just to really think about the connection between the energy we depend on and where it comes from. And, the petroleum industry, which is dominant right now, is a fire industry. And it is creating the conditions for fire to burn more intensely, due to CO2 and methane emissions. And so it raises a really interesting question. Is fire serving us, or are we serving fire by creating hotter, drier conditions so that fire can burn more intensely, more broadly, and for more months of a given year. And, from my point of view, I do wonder if, when we look at this historically, 500 years from now, it will be humans who serve fire ultimately. And we have control over that. We can change that narrative, and some incredibly exciting things are happening right now with a carbon neutral energy transition, a low carbon energy transition. And that bears more scrutiny and more attention, I think.
Well, John, this was just awesome. I love the whole process of reading the book and preparing for this, and then getting the chance to chat with you and ask you all these questions I have. It's just really, really great. I'd love to have you come back at some point, because I know you've got a really interesting story pre-writing that we could probably do another hour or more about. But I just thank you so much for, first of all, taking the time to talk with me, and then for all your work and everything you do. And I'm really glad to know you, and I hope we can continue the conversation in person one of these days.
Well, Ed, this has really been a pleasure for me. I love the kind of leisurely, wide-ranging mode, and because I've done a lot of 3-minute, 5-minute, 7-minute hit, and you're just blathering away, and who knows what you're saying. But here, I just love you've got a more relaxed way that feels more like we're having a beer. So that was really nice for me. It's a great way to start my day, and I just appreciate your good attention and close reading very much.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.